Cora Halloran dropped the reins, and the sound of the worn leather slapping against the tired horse's neck was the only sound in the vast, indifferent quiet of the high country. The animal, a mare whose ribs showed like the hoops of a collapsed barrel, lowered her head and stood, defeated. Cora did not blame her. She felt the same bone-deep weariness in her own marrow. Beside her, her son, Leo, a small, silent shadow in a coat that had grown too short at the wrists, stared at the ranch house below. It was less a house and more a collection of logs that had surrendered to gravity and time, hunkered down against a wind that never seemed to stop. She slid from the saddle, her body crying out in a chorus of aches. They had been riding for 2 weeks, sleeping in dry creek beds and under the sparse shelter of pines, living off jerky and the last of the hardtack. The money was gone, save for a single silver dollar and a few copper cents tucked into the lining of her boot. This place, Blackwater Creek Ranch, was the last name on a list she had scribbled on a piece of paper, now as soft and frayed as a prayer. It was the last chance before the world swallowed them whole. Cora looked at her hands. The knuckles were raw, the skin cracked from sun and wind and work. They were not the hands of a woman seeking pity. They were the hands of a woman who knew how to turn a barren plot into a garden, a sick calf into a healthy steer, a set of disparate numbers into a balanced ledger. They were the hands that had buried a husband and then tried with all their might to hold on to the life they had built together. They were the hands that had failed, but they were still capable hands. "Stay with the horse, Leo," she said, her voice a low rasp. The boy didn't answer. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in the 6 months since they had watched their own ranch in the Panhandle turn to dust and blow away. He simply tightened his grip on a smooth gray stone he'd been carrying since they crossed the Platte River and gave a small, solemn nod. His eyes, the same shade of serious blue as his father's, were fixed on the sprawling, untidy collection of buildings. She took her 2 carpet bags from the back of the mare, the meager sum of their worldly possessions, and set them in the dirt. The dust puffed up in a cloud of pale brown, clinging to the hem of her worn skirt. She straightened her shoulders, a conscious act of defiance against the exhaustion that threatened to fold her in half. She was Cora Halloran. She was not beaten. She was simply at the end of a very long road. She hoped, with a desperation that felt like a physical sickness, that it was not a dead end. A man emerged from the largest of the log buildings, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall and broad, but he moved with the slow, deliberate gait of someone carrying a weight far heavier than his own body. His hair was a shock of iron gray, his face a landscape of deep lines carved by weather and worry. He stopped on the porch, his eyes narrowing. They were the gray of creek stones after a rain, hard and unyielding. This had to be the owner, Silas Blackwood. He watched her approach, his expression closed, shuttered. He did not move to help her, nor did he offer a greeting. He just waited, a sentinel guarding a kingdom of dust and disappointment. "Looking for a handout?" he called out, his voice rough as gravel. "Keep moving. I'm not running a mission here." Cora stopped a few feet from the porch steps. She did not flinch at his tone. She had expected it. Men like this, men who ran these isolated outposts, were hardened by necessity. Softness was a luxury they couldn't afford. "I'm not looking for a handout," she said, her own voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm looking for work." He gave a short, bitter laugh. It was a sound with no humor in it. "Work? Lady, look around. Does this look like a place that's hiring?" He gestured with a sweep of his arm, a gesture that encompassed the leaning fences, the barn with its sway-backed roof, the general air of neglect that clung to the place like a shroud. "I'm 2 hands short and 3 months behind. The last thing I need is another mouth to feed." "I can cook," she started. "I've got a man who can burn beans with the best of them," he cut her off. She held his gaze, refusing to be dismissed. This was the moment. Not a plea, but a statement of fact. "I can cook for 10 men and make the supplies last," she said, her voice clear and direct. "I can mend clothes so the stitches hold, and I can mend a fence so a bull can't break it. I can track a lost steer, help with a difficult birth, and I can read a brand from 100 yards. I can also read a ledger. I can tell you where your money is going and why you don't have enough of it. I am not another mouth to feed, Mr. Blackwood. I am an investment." She paused, letting the words settle in the cold air between them. And I have a son who eats very little. Silas Blackwood stared at her. He had been approached by desperate people before. Drifters, failed prospectors, men on the run. They all had a story, a plea. They begged, they whined. This woman did neither. She stood in the dirt, her dignity as plain and solid as the mountains behind her, and presented him with a list of her qualifications as if she were applying for a position at a bank in Cheyenne. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it almost made him smile. Almost. But the territory right next to his smile was still miles away for a man like him. His gaze flickered past her to the boy standing silently by the horse. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or a deeper, older pain, crossed his face before the mask of indifference slammed back down. He had lost his own wife and daughter to a fever years ago. The presence of a child on his land was an unwelcome ghost. "I told you," he said, his voice flat. "I'm not hiring." It was then that the world shifted. A shout came from the direction of the creek, followed by the splintering crack of old wood. "Boss, they're through!" Silas swore, a low, vicious sound. He spun around to see a small group of yearlings, maybe half a dozen, pouring through a collapsed section of fence along the creek bank. Two men, one young and wiry, the other older and thicker, were scrambling to head them off, but the cattle were spooked, their eyes wide with panic. They were heading for the open country, and a half-dozen lost yearlings was a loss he couldn't afford. He started to run, shouting orders that were lost in the wind, but Cora was already moving. In a single fluid motion, she turned, placed her son's small hand into the large, calloused one of an old man who had been silently watching from the shade of the bunkhouse, and said, "Watch him." She didn't wait for a reply. She sprinted to a nearby fence post where a coil of rope hung, her exhaustion forgotten, replaced by a surge of pure, focused energy. She grabbed the rope, her fingers finding the familiar stiffness of the hemp. She didn't run toward the cattle head-on. She ran parallel to them, her eyes on the lead steer, a leggy brindle. She saw his path, saw the way he was turning, leading the others toward a rocky cut. Her mind, honed by years of this exact dance, calculated the angle. She swung the rope, a short, efficient loop, not a showman's throw. It sailed through the air and settled neatly over the brindle's horns. She didn't jerk the rope. She didn't try to stop him cold. That would only make him fight. Instead, she dug her heels into the dirt, braced herself, and simply pulled, applying steady pressure to the side of his head, turning him. It was a subtle, insistent guidance, a conversation in the language of pressure and release. The steer, confused, slowed its panicked flight. It stumbled, turned, and found itself facing back toward the pasture. The other yearlings, followers by nature, faltered, milled in confusion, and then turned with their leader. The two ranch hands, Billy and Jed, stared, momentarily stunned. Then they moved in, their own ropes now useful, hazing the small herd back through the gap in the fence. Cora stood, breathing heavily, coiling the rope with practiced, economical movements. She walked to the broken fence. She pointed at a section of post that was dark and soft with rot. "That's your problem," she said, not to anyone in particular, but to the situation itself. "The whole section needs replacing. A patch won't hold through the winter." Silas Blackwood had stopped running. He had watched the entire thing. He had seen the way she moved, the lack of wasted motion, the instinctual understanding of the animal. He had seen the way she diagnosed the problem with the fence in a single glance. He had seen competence so profound it was like a force of nature. He walked over to her, his boots silent in the thick dust. He looked at the coiled rope in her hand. He looked at her face, flushed with exertion but calm. He looked at the cattle, now safely back where they belonged. He looked at Jed and Billy, who were staring at this strange woman with a mixture of awe and suspicion. He was a man who trusted what he could see. He had seen a problem, and he had seen it solved. He was still deeply suspicious. He had been burned before, badly, by a smooth-talking foreman who had nearly cost him everything. Trust was a currency he no longer traded in, but necessity was a harsh master. He cleared his throat. Clear's throat. The old line shack at the end of the valley. It's empty. You and the boy can use it. Cora's heart gave a painful lurch. She kept her face impassive. "Cook and mending," he stated, his voice all business. "You'll feed the crew, 3 meals a day. I'll take it out of your wages for the supplies you and the boy use." He paused, his gray eyes pinning her. 1 week, that's the deal. After 1 week, we'll see." It wasn't a welcome, it was a stay of execution, but it was more than she'd had an hour ago. "Thank you," Cora said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 desperate miles. Silas just grunted in response, turning his back on her to survey the damaged fence as if she were already a detail he had forgotten. But as he walked away, he glanced back one more time at the woman who stood straight and tall in the fading light, a coiled rope in her hand, a silent boy now back at her side. He saw the way she picked up her worn carpet bags, her movements still efficient, still unbroken. He saw her walk toward the old man, Gus, and retrieve her son. He saw her speak to the boy, her head bent low, a moment of private softness in this hard place. For the first time in a long time, Silas Blackwood felt something other than the familiar grinding weight of weariness. It was a flicker of grudging respect, small and unwelcome, but there all the same. He didn't like it. He didn't trust it. But he couldn't deny what he had seen. The line shack was little more than a single room with a stone fireplace, a rickety table, and 2 built-in bunks. It smelled of dust and disuse, but the roof looked sound, and when Cora pushed on the walls, they felt solid. It was shelter. It was enough. While Leo explored the corners of their new, temporary world, his small fingers tracing the patterns in the rough-hewn logs, Cora went to work. She swept the floor with a broom made of bound twigs she found outside, chased out a pack rat's nest from under a bunk, and used precious water from her canteen to wipe down every surface. By the time darkness fell, the small room was clean. It was a tiny island of order in the vast chaos of her life. The next morning, long before the sun had thought about touching the peaks to the east, Cora was in the main ranch house kitchen. It was a disaster. Greasy pots were piled in a dry sink, a film of grime covered the wood-burning stove, and the pantry was a jumble of half-empty sacks of flour, beans, and coffee, all of it smelling faintly of mice. The man Silas had mentioned, the one who burned beans, had clearly taken a scorched earth approach to cooking. Cora felt a grim satisfaction settle over her. This was a mess she knew how to fix. She tied her hair back, rolled up her sleeves, and began. She stoked the fire in the stove, her movements practiced and sure. She found a side of bacon hanging in the cool pantry, a sack of stone-ground cornmeal, and a tin of coffee. While the stove heated, she scoured the pots with sand and lye soap until they shone. Soon, a new set of smells began to drift out of the cookhouse, smells the Blackwater Creek Ranch hadn't known in years. Not the smell of scorched coffee and burnt bacon, but the rich, dark aroma of coffee brewed properly, the salty sizzle of thick-cut bacon, and the warm, comforting scent of sourdough biscuits rising in a cast-iron pan. The ranch hands, drawn by the unfamiliar and enticing smells, shuffled into the cookhouse one by one. They stopped in the doorway, their expressions a mixture of surprise and suspicion. The long trestle table was clean. The tin plates and cups were stacked neatly. And at the stove, a woman they didn't know was calmly flipping biscuits onto a platter. Jed, the stocky older hand from the day before, was the first to speak. "What's all this?" he grumbled, though his eyes were fixed on the platter of golden-brown biscuits. "Breakfast," Cora said simply, not turning around. "Plates are on the table, coffee's on the stove." They ate in a kind of stunned silence. The coffee was strong and hot, not the bitter, lukewarm sludge they were used to. The biscuits were light and fluffy, the bacon crisp. It was more than just food, it was a statement. It was a quiet declaration of competence that needed no words. Billy, the young, wiry hand, ate 3 biscuits and looked at Cora with something approaching reverence. Gus, the old-timer who had held Leo's hand, ate slowly, methodically, and when he was done, he gave Cora a short, almost imperceptible nod before he left. It was the highest praise he was capable of giving. Cora's work did not stop at the kitchen. Throughout the day, she moved with that same unhurried, methodical purpose. She inventoried the pantry, her neat handwriting filling a small notebook with lists of what they had and what they desperately needed. She found a pile of torn shirts and worn-out trousers in a corner of the bunkhouse and set to mending them, her stitches small, neat, and stronger than the original fabric. She wasn't just performing tasks, she was restoring order, weaving a thread of stability into the frayed fabric of the ranch. Silas Blackwood watched her from a distance. He saw the clean kitchen, smelled the good food. He saw the men who were usually grumbling and morose, working with a little more energy. He noticed the pile of mended clothes. He saw her talking to Billy, pointing out a better way to store the harnesses to keep the leather from cracking. He saw her son, Leo, sitting on the porch steps of the line shack, carefully trying to whittle a piece of scrap wood, a small, focused figure who made no trouble. He told himself it was just for a week. He was just using her skills until he could get back on his feet. He was not getting attached. He was not letting his guard down. But as he ate his dinner that night, a hearty beef stew with root vegetables she had found in the cellar, thick and flavorful, he found it harder to hold on to his cynicism. The stew tasted of care. It tasted of a knowledge he had long forgotten. It tasted unsettlingly, like home. The first few days settled into a rhythm. Cora would rise in the dark, her work a constant quiet hum in the background of the ranch's daily life. She learned the men's habits, who took sugar in their coffee, who preferred the heel of the bread. She learned the sounds of the ranch, the groan of the windmill, the lowing of the cattle in the morning, the sharp, clear ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Her relationship with the crew began to solidify. Billy was her first true ally. He was young, eager, and not yet hardened into cynicism. He would bring her a bucket of fresh water without being asked, or save a particularly interesting bird's feather for Leo. He saw in Cora not a threat, but a source of stability. He started talking to Leo, showing him how to tie a knot or pointing out the different calls of the birds. And one afternoon, Leo, who had barely spoken a word, whispered, "Thank you," when Billy helped him retrieve a dropped whittling stick. The word was so quiet, Billy almost missed it, but he heard it, and he looked over at Cora with a wide, surprised grin. Gus, the old sage, remained a creature of few words, but his support was shown in gestures. One day, as Cora was kneading a large batch of dough for the week's bread, her arms aching, Gus entered the kitchen. He didn't speak. He walked over to the wood bin, which was nearly empty, and then left. An hour later, the bin was filled to the brim with perfectly split, dry pine. Another time, he left a small, intricately carved wooden horse on the railing of the line shack porch for Leo. It was a silent, profound vote of confidence. But not everyone was won over. Jed was the holdout. He was a man who measured the world by the way things had always been done. He had been with Silas for 10 years, through good times and bad, and he saw Cora as an interloper, a disruption to the established order. Her efficiency felt like a judgment on his own way of doing things. "We've been rationing beans for a year," he grumbled to Billy one evening, loud enough for Cora to hear from the kitchen. "Now she comes in, cooking up stews like we're made of money." "The stew was made from the same salted beef we've been eating," Billy countered. "She just knows how to cook it." "And what's she doing with the ledgers?" Jed pressed on, his voice laced with suspicion. "That ain't cook's work. A woman's place is in the kitchen, not in the boss's books." The tension came to a head a few days later. It was evening, and the men had finished their supper. Cora was alone in the main house kitchen, cleaning up. The big cast-iron skillet, heavy and black, was warming on the stove with water to loosen the remnants of the meal. She had spent the afternoon going over the ranch's account books, which Silas had grudgingly allowed her to look at after she'd pointed out the absurdity of buying supplies without a proper inventory. The books were a mess, a chaotic scrawl of numbers and names that told a story of desperation and poor management. Jed filled the doorway, his bulk blocking the light. "I want a word with you, Mrs. Halloran." Cora did not stop her work. She picked up the heavy skillet, her hand accustomed to its weight, and carried it to the sink. "I'm listening, Jed." "You're overstepping," he said, his voice low and accusatory. "This is a man's outfit. We don't need a woman telling us how to run our business." He gestured toward the small, leather-bound ledger on the table. "Those books are the boss's concern, not yours." Cora placed the skillet in the sink. She turned, wiping her damp hands on her apron, and faced him. She was half his size, but she did not seem intimidated. Her gaze was direct, her posture unwavering. "Mr. Blackwood is being robbed," she said, her voice calm and even. The statement hung in the air, clean and sharp as a shard of glass. Jed's face darkened. "That's a hell of an accusation." "It's a fact," Cora replied. She walked to the table and tapped the open ledger. "You buy your salt, your flour, your barbed wire from Marcus Thorne's supply store in town, don't you?" "Thorne gives us credit when no one else will," Jed shot back defensively. "He also charges you nearly double the catalog price for every item," Cora said, her voice never rising. "I looked at the receipts. You're paying 10 cents a pound for salt that you can order from the Montgomery Ward catalog for 6, including the shipping. You're losing $40 for every 500-pound shipment you paid for a delivery of winter feed last month that, according to the inventory, never arrived. The money is leaking out of this ranch, Jed, and it's all flowing into Marcus Thorne's pockets. That's my business if my son and I are to eat. It's every man's business who draws a wage from this ranch." Jed was speechless. He stared at the numbers, his blustering anger deflating into confusion. He was a man of cattle and fences, not numbers and receipts. He had always just done what he was told, picked up the supplies from Thorne because that's what they always did. At that moment, Silas Blackwood appeared in the doorway behind Jed. He had been on the porch listening. His face was unreadable. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice quiet. Cora met his gaze. "The numbers are right there in your own hand, Mr. Blackwood. Compare the receipts from Thorne's with the prices in this catalog." She pushed the well-worn catalog across the table. Silas walked past Jed, who looked as if he'd been turned to stone. He picked up the ledger and the catalog. He stood there for a long time, his head bent, the silence in the room broken only by the hiss of the water in the hot skillet. The lines on his face seemed to deepen. He looked not at Jed, but at Cora. "Jed," he said, his voice dangerously low, "get out. Go check the north pasture fence, now." Jed, his face a mixture of shame and resentment, turned and fled the room. Silas sank into a chair at the table, the ledger still open in front of him. He looked like a man who had been punched in the gut. "Thorne," he said, the name a curse. "I knew he was a snake. I just didn't know how deep his fangs were." He looked up at Cora, and for the first time, she saw the weary guard in his eyes fall away, replaced by a raw, profound exhaustion. "The foreman I had before Jed, he was the one who set up the account with Thorne, told me it was the only way. Turns out they were partners, skimmed me for 2 years before I caught on, fired him, but I was already in deep with Thorne." He looked at his hands, then back at the ledger. "I stopped trusting anyone with these books after that. Figured if I was going to be ruined, I'd rather do it myself." He gave a dry, mirthless chuckle. "Looks like I was succeeding." Cora pulled out the other chair and sat down opposite him. The skillet was forgotten in the sink. This was a new frontier, a different kind of work. "You're not ruined yet," she said softly. He looked at her, a long, searching look. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't saying, "I told you so." She was simply stating a fact, offering a sliver of hope where he had seen none. The 1-week probationary period was forgotten. In that moment, Cora Halloran ceased to be just the cook. She became something else entirely, something he hadn't realized he desperately needed. An ally. Over the next week, the kitchen table became their war room. Cora's 1-week trial was never mentioned again. It had become an unspoken truth that her presence was no longer temporary. By day, she still ran the kitchen and the household with her quiet efficiency, but by night, she and Silas huddled over the chaotic mess of the ranch's finances. For Cora, it was like untangling a massive knotted fishing line. Each knot she loosened revealed another, more complicated one beneath. She worked methodically, with the same focus she applied to kneading dough. She separated receipts, organized invoices, and created new, clean pages in a fresh ledger. Her handwriting was a stark contrast to Silas's jagged scrawl. It was clear, precise, and logical. As she worked, she began to see the full picture, a slow, methodical strangulation of the ranch by Marcus Thorne. It wasn't just the inflated prices. It was more insidious. "Look here," she said one evening, pushing a stack of papers toward Silas. The lamp cast a warm glow on their faces, creating an island of light in the dark, quiet house. Leo was asleep in the line shack, looked after by Billy, who had offered to sit with him. "This is a bill for 3 new saddles from last year. Did you get them?" Silas squinted at the paper. "No, I ordered them, but Thorne said the shipment was lost in a storm. He gave me credit for it." "He didn't give you credit," Cora said, her finger tracing a line in the ledger. "He charged you for the saddles, and then, 6 months later, He added a storage fee for the replacement saddles that also never arrived. And here, she pointed to another page, is a recurring payment every month to a law firm in Cheyenne. Legal consultation fees, it says. I never hired a lawyer in Cheyenne, Silas said, his voice grim. I know, Cora replied, but I have a feeling Marcus Thorne did. Her greatest discovery came from a dusty, forgotten trunk in the corner of Silas's small office. It was filled with old papers, deeds, and contracts going back to when his father had first claimed this land. Deep at the bottom, she found the original loan agreement he had signed with the bank in Laramie 5 years ago, the loan that Marcus Thorne had since bought, making him Silas's sole creditor. She read it by lamplight, her brow furrowed in concentration. Most of it was standard legal language, dense and designed to confuse. But then she found it. A single paragraph tucked away in the back pages under a section titled Contingencies and Unforeseen Circumstances. It was a force majeure clause, an act of God clause. It stated that in the event of a catastrophic natural disaster, specifically mentioning fire, flood, or an impassable blizzard that prevented the borrower from transporting his goods to market, all loan payments and legal proceedings would be suspended for a period of 90 days. Her heart began to beat faster. She read it again, then a third time. It was clear. It was unambiguous. She brought the document to Silas, her finger pressed firmly on the clause. This is it, she said, her voice filled with a quiet excitement. This is your leverage. Silas took the document, his big, rough hands surprisingly gentle with the fragile paper. He read the clause, his lips moving silently. He looked up at her, his gray eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous hope. He had been so beaten down by Thorne's constant pressure, so convinced of his own impending failure, that he had never thought to look for a weapon in the very contract that was being used against him. The forecast from the freight office in town, Cora said, leaning forward. They're calling for the worst snow in a decade, due to hit by the end of the week. The pieces clicked into place. It was a lifeline, a desperate, long-shot chance, but a chance nonetheless. If the blizzard hit as predicted, and it was severe enough to block the passes, he could legally invoke this clause. It would halt Thorne's relentless pressure. It would give them 90 days to find a new buyer for his cattle, to expose Thorne's fraudulent billing, to fight back. Silas stared at the paper, then at the woman sitting across from him. He had hired a cook to fill his belly. He had gotten a general to plan his war. He slowly folded the paper and placed it on the table. He looked at her, and the last of his defenses crumbled. The weariness was still there, but it was now joined by a profound, humbling gratitude. I haven't trusted anyone with these books in 5 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not since Reynolds, my old foreman, betrayed me. He shook his head, a deep-seated pain surfacing in his eyes. He was more than a foreman. He was a friend. I trusted him like a brother, and he sold me out to Thorne for a piece of the action. He let out a long, slow breath. After that, I figured it was better to be alone, better to fail on my own terms than to be made a fool of again. He looked directly at her. Maybe I've just been trusting the wrong people. The moment was broken by a sharp rap on the door. It was Billy, his face pale in the lantern light. Boss, you better come. There's a rider coming up the valley road. Looks like Thorne. And he's got the sheriff with him. The world, which had just opened up with possibility, suddenly snapped shut again. Thorne was making his move, and he was making it now, just days before the storm that was their only hope. Marcus Thorne sat on his pristine black gelding like a king surveying his new domain. He was a man whose softness was a weapon. His hands were clean, his suit well-tailored, his smile thin and predatory. Beside him, the county sheriff, a decent but duty-bound man named Elias Rowe, looked distinctly uncomfortable. Blackwood, Thorne called out, his voice carrying an oily confidence. He held up a sheaf of papers. This is a foreclosure notice legally executed. You've defaulted on your payment schedule. According to the terms of our agreement, the property and all assets revert to me, effective immediately. Silas strode onto the porch, his face a thundercloud. Cora stood just inside the doorway, the precious loan document clutched in her hand. The hell it is, Silas growled. Payment isn't due for another week. Ah, Thorne said, feigning sympathy. You must have missed the acceleration clause. Any single missed payment, like that phantom feed delivery you conveniently never received, allows the creditor to demand the full balance immediately. It's all perfectly legal. The judge signed off on it this morning. He had timed it perfectly. He knew the storm was coming. He was moving to seize the ranch before the act of God clause could ever be invoked. Silas was trapped. He was a man of action, of fences and cattle, not legal trickery. He could see the truth in the sheriff's reluctant eyes. Sheriff Rowe was just a man enforcing a piece of paper signed by a judge. Silas's rage was a physical thing, a pressure building in his chest. But it had nowhere to go. He was legally and completely cornered. He looked at his land, the land his father had tamed, and felt the bitter taste of defeat. He was powerless. The first snowflake drifted down from a sky the color of lead. It landed on Thorne's shoulder, a single perfect crystal, then another and another. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that promised a terrible fury to come. Thorne smirked. Looks like the weather is turning. Best we get this business concluded so you can pack your things, Blackwood. While Silas stood frozen in a state of impotent fury, arguing a losing battle with the sheriff, Cora acted. Her mind was an oasis of calm in the rising storm of emotion and weather. She saw the path, the one move that could change the entire game. She did not ask for permission. She did not wait to be told. She took charge. First, she turned to Billy, who was standing wide-eyed by the porch. "Billy," she said, her voice low but carrying an undeniable authority, "get Gus, take every head of cattle and drive them deep into the sheltered canyon behind the ridge. Don't stop until they're protected from the worst of the wind. Move now." Billy, hearing the command in her voice, simply nodded and ran toward the bunkhouse. Next, she looked at Jed, who was watching the scene unfold with a conflicted expression. "Jed, the new foals are in the east paddock. They'll never survive this out there. Get them into the main barn, secure the doors, check the roof." Jed hesitated for only a second, then, seeing the logic and urgency, he too turned and ran to do her bidding. She was no longer just the cook, she was the only one thinking clearly. Then she walked out onto the porch. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, and the snow was beginning to fall in earnest now, no longer a gentle drift, but a thick, swirling curtain. She ignored Marcus Thorne completely, as if he were nothing more than a piece of scenery. She walked directly to Sheriff Rowe. "Sheriff," she said, her voice steady and clear despite the rising wind. She held out the old folded loan document. "I believe you'll want to see this." The sheriff, surprised, took the paper. Thorne tried to intervene. "That's just some old piece of paper. The court order is all that matters." Cora held the sheriff's gaze. "Page 7, paragraph 3, Sheriff. Please read it." Sheriff Rowe, a man who believed in doing things by the book, unfolded the document. He squinted, holding it close to his face to shield it from the thickening snow. He found the page, the paragraph. He read it silently. His eyebrows rose. He read it again. Cora pointed a finger toward the sky, which was now a churning mass of gray and white. "It's snowing, Sheriff. The passes will be closed by morning. According to that contract, the very contract that makes Mr. Thorne the creditor, all legal proceedings are to be suspended in the event of an impassable blizzard." She paused, letting the truth of it sink in. By trying to enforce this foreclosure now, you wouldn't be upholding the law. You would be helping him break his own contract. The victory was not loud. It was a quiet, intellectual checkmate. It was the click of a lock falling into place. The sheriff lowered the paper. He looked at the snow, which was already beginning to pile up on the porch railing. He looked at Thorne's face, which had transformed from smug confidence to a mask of pure, sputtering rage. He looked at Silas, who was staring at Cora with an expression of utter astonishment. Finally, he looked back at the calm, resolute woman in the simple dress who stood unshaken in the heart of the storm. Sheriff Rowe folded the loan document carefully and handed it back to Cora. He settled his hat more firmly on his head. "She has a point, Thorne," he said, his voice firm. "The contract is the contract. This is now a matter for a judge to sort out after the weather clears, not for me to settle on a man's porch in the middle of a blizzard." He turned to Silas and tipped his hat. "My apologies for the intrusion, Blackwood." Then he turned his horse and rode away, disappearing into the white curtain of snow. Thorne was left alone, his legal weapon snatched from his hand, his perfect plan in ruins. He stared at Cora, his eyes burning with a hatred that was cold and sharp. He had been outmaneuvered, not by Silas's strength, not by a gun, but by the intelligence of a woman he had dismissed as a piece of household furniture. He saw the ranch hands, Jed included, now gathered behind Silas and Cora, their expressions hard and united. He had not just lost the battle, he had lost the war for their respect, a currency more valuable than money in this part of the country. Without another word, he wrenched his horse's head around and spurred it brutally down the valley road, a dark, furious figure swallowed by the storm. On the porch, there was a moment of profound silence, broken only by the howl of the wind. Silas looked at the swirling snow, then at Cora. She was still standing there, the loan document held safely in her hand, her face calm. He saw in that moment the full scope of her character, her intelligence, her courage, her unshakable integrity. She had not only saved his ranch, she had saved him from himself. The blizzard raged for 3 days. It was a white monster, burying fences, piling drifts as high as the bunkhouse roof, and isolating the Blackwater Creek Ranch from the rest of the world. But inside, a new kind of warmth had taken root. The ranch, which had been a place of grim survival, was now a fortress, united against the storm and the threat that had been turned back at its gate. The men worked with a shared purpose, their respect for Cora now absolute and unspoken. She was the one who had seen the path when they were all blind. When the storm finally broke, the world was transformed, blanketed in a pristine, silent white. The air was clean and cold, and the sun on the snow was blinding. The ranch had survived. More than that, it felt reborn. A week later, after the passes had been cleared and news of Thorne's failed, underhanded takeover had spread through the territory, Silas found Cora in the kitchen. She was polishing the big copper kettle, her movements rhythmic and soothing. The late afternoon sun streamed through the clean window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was quiet. Leo was outside, his laughter now a frequent sound on the ranch as he and Billy built a lopsided snowman. Silas stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her. He was holding the new ledger she had created, its pages filled with her neat, orderly script. It was a book of hope, a map out of the wilderness. He cleared his throat and she turned, a small, questioning smile on her lips. He walked over to the table and sat down, placing the ledger between them. "You know," he began, his voice rough, unaccustomed to the words he was about to say. "When you first arrived, I told you I wasn't hiring." He looked down at his own scarred hands, then back up at her. "I was hiring a cook. I thought that's what I needed to keep this place from falling apart completely." He paused, searching for the right words. "I was wrong," he said, his voice softer now. "What this ranch needed wasn't just a cook. What I needed was a partner." The word hung in the quiet room, freighted with meaning. It was more than a business proposition. It was an admission, a confession, a plea. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the polished surface of the table toward her. It wasn't an old, crumbling document. It was fresh, the ink still dark. "I had the lawyer in town, an honest one this time, draw this up," he said. "It's a partnership agreement. It makes you a full, equal partner in the Blackwater Creek Ranch, half of everything, the land, the cattle, the debts, and the future." Cora looked at the paper, then at his face. She saw the hope there, but also the fear of rejection. He was offering her everything he had, placing his trust, his future, entirely in her hands. She remembered arriving here, a desperate woman with nothing but her own competence and a silent son. She had been looking for a job, a place to weather the storm of her life. She looked past him, out the window. She saw her son, his face alight with joy as he threw a snowball. She saw the vast, beautiful, and brutal landscape that she had come to understand. She had not just found a refuge here. Through her own work, her own intelligence, her own resilience, she had forged a home. She did not accept out of desperation. She accepted as an equal, as a woman choosing her own destiny. She slid the paper back toward him, a gesture of finality. His face fell for a fraction of a second before she spoke. "It needs one change," she said, her voice steady. "What's that?" he asked, his voice tight. It should be a partnership between three people, she said, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. You, me, and Leo. The tension in Silas's shoulders disappeared, replaced by a wave of relief so profound it was visible. A slow smile spread across his face, a real one this time, crinkling the corners of his eyes. It transformed his harsh features, revealing the man he had been before the world had tried to break him. I think the lawyer can manage that, he said. Music. The final scene is not one of high drama or grand pronouncements. It is a quiet evening in the following spring. The land is green and alive. Cora sits on the porch of the main house, her hands still calloused, but no longer raw, expertly mending a piece of leather tack. Her movements are sure and practiced, the picture of contentment. Nearby, Leo is chattering away to Gus, explaining the intricate rules of a game he has invented with stones and twigs. His silence is a distant memory, washed away by the security and love he has found here. Silas comes out of the house and sits in the chair beside her. He doesn't speak for a long time. He just sits, his presence a comfortable weight. He is no longer the weary, cynical man she first met. The burden has been shared, and in sharing it, it has become lighter. He looks at the fat, healthy cattle grazing in the valley below. He looks at the laughing boy. He looks at the capable, resilient woman beside him, the architect of this newfound peace. He had thought his life was over, that the ranch was just a place to preside over a slow decay. He had been wrong. Blackwater Creek Ranch hadn't needed another hired hand or a temporary cook, or even a savior from its debts. What it got in the end was the woman who made it a home.